Hello, once again, it's Sandra, your host for Generational Ministries, and today's title for our short story is What About Nicholas? I've often been asked where my lesson subjects come from, where do I get my titles, and the truth is they come from a variety of places. They come from childhood memories, lessons learned in life, conversations with others, personal time spent alone with God, listening for teaching, listening to other people teach, such as my pastor and other preachers and teachers. The idea for this particular lesson was born in a junior Sunday school class by way of a precious little girl named Ebony. The Sunday school lesson that day was about washing feet, as in Jesus washed the disciples' feet. One of the teachers asked, "Have you ever had to wash the feet of someone you didn't particularly care for?" Ebony responded with a typical childlike honesty with one name, Nicholas, indicating that Nicholas was absolutely last on her list of people that she wanted to be in relationship with. If we are as honest as Ebony, we too have some Nicholases in our life. Nicholas may be the kind of person that is always irritating, like pulling your hair or acting up. Nicholas may be the brother or sister that always has some kind of drama going on and depends on you to straighten it out. Nicholas may be the one that always seems to need to borrow money or something, a car, $10, want to be taking this place or want to be run that place. Nicholas wants you to cook him some or want to borrow some clothes, your lawnmower, want to borrow your kids to babysit their kids. Sometimes Nicholas calls you up and spend hours telling you about their problems. But when you have a problem, Nicholas can't be found. Or perhaps your Nicholas is the kind of person that knows it all. No matter what the subject, they're the expert. Then there's the morality police Nicholas. This is the one that seems to have the job of pointing out all of your indiscretions, which may not be a bad thing if it's done in patience and love, but Nicholas just points out everything and never even notices his own faults. Nicholas may be a difficult in-law, a brother, sister, or cousin. Nicholas may be the neighbor we dodge when we see him outside. Nicholas may be your pastor, deacon, or any other church worker. Whoever Nicholas is in our life, this is the person that many times we could really do without. What's more, God will not remove him. For some reason, he allows Nicholas to remain and just rub us like sandpaper on wood. Why? Why, we wonder. The question will be answered at the end of our lesson. In this lesson, we will see many people with Nicholases in their life. We will also see what these Nicholas brought out of the personalities of our characters. Remember, God has his reasons for the Nick in our life. Yes, Nicholas is hard to understand and many times even harder to love. John 19:19 ends with this: "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." But what about Nicholas? We will begin our lesson with Genesis 12 and talk about Abraham's Nicholas, which was his nephew Lot. For some reason, when Abraham left Ur, he took Lot with him. Lot is his nephew. In their journey, Lot finds himself in one drama after another. You guessed it, good old Abraham bails him out. When an argument breaks out between their herdsmen, Abraham is the one who settles the dispute and peacefully goes about his way. When war broke out among the kings against Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 14 of Genesis, Lot was caught right up in the middle of it. Again, here comes Uncle Abe to his rescue by going to war and delivering him from his enemies. Genesis 18:21 through 33 finds Abraham interceding with God for Lot's sake, as God has intentions of destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, which is at this time Lot's home. Of course, Lot was going to settle down and got Sodom and Gomorrah, because it look like wherever trouble is, there's Lot. I wonder what we would do if we were Abraham and heard that God was going to destroy a town that we knew about. Would we beg God for the Nicholas in our life, or would we thank God for the opportunity to be rid of Nicholas for once and for all? While we're in the book of Genesis, let's look at Nicholas in Sarah's life. Sarah was Abraham's wife, and she too had her very own Nicholas. Her name was Hagar. Now Hagar was a Nicholas of Sarah's own making. In her excessive desire to have Abraham's child, Sarah forces her maid Hagar into a relationship with Abraham to obtain a child by her. Hagar does bear the son, but problems come along when Sarah herself has a son from her own body. Now what is she to do with Nicholas? We mean Hagar. There she sits with Ishmael, day after day, getting Abraham's attention and his time. Bear in mind that 13 years passes between the birth of Nicholas' son and Sarah's son, the Nicholas being Hagar. Imagine Sarah sitting there watching as her Nicholas preens and fusses over little Nicholas, that would be Ishmael. So now Sarah got two Nicholases in her life. Can you imagine that? Abraham has to teach the little boy how to hunt and be a man. And what's more upsetting, Sarah knows in her heart that this is her own fault. How many of us have invited people into our life, and when their youthfulness is run out, we find ourselves living with a Nicholas of our own making. Now we want to get rid of them. No longer want them around, yet can't think of a way to get rid of them. Think about that for a while as we pull up to another Nicholas. This Nicholas can also be found in the book of Genesis. Chapter 37. To his brothers, he is known by the name of Joseph. Joseph is one of those people who is born a Nicholas and don't even realize it. From the get-go, he rubs his brothers the wrong way. Guess why? He was their father's favorite son, and this caused his brothers to hate him with a perfect hatred. Nicholas is that Joseph. He would follow them around, making a pest of himself, and to make matters worse, his dad gives him an unusually beautiful coat. Now don't it just grate on your nerve when someone you don't like get blessed? On top of that, Joseph had the gift of interpreting dreams, but he hadn't come to this realization yet, nor was he aware of the sheer hatred his brothers felt towards him, as he told them about two of his dreams in which they would be bowing to him. To be fair, the little guy didn't ask to be his father's favorite, nor could he help being born late, nor did he ask for the gift of interpretation. In fact, what is now considered by his brothers to be a curse turns out to be a blessing for them down the road. But right now, he is simply Nicholas in their life. As said before, Joseph more than likely didn't even realize he was Nicholas. It probably wasn't until he was on his way to Egypt, having been sold into slavery by his brothers, that he realized he was definitely not one of the boys. Those guys meant business. They saw their chance to get rid of Nicholas, and they took it. But at what cost? Why does God allow them to get rid of Nicholas? Do we ever really get rid of Nicholas? Is our hearts and minds ever free from the one we think we've gotten rid of? Or does God give us a temporary repass and just let us think that Nicholas is gone for good? Ponder those questions in your mind as we deal with yet another Nicholas. The next Nicholas belongs to King. So you see, no matter what one's stature in life is, God always managed to slip a Nicholas in on us. Whether you're poor or rich, whatever your color is, whatever denomination, everybody has to deal with a Nicholas. The first Nicholas belongs to the king of Egypt, or better known as a Pharaoh. This Nicholas is also Moses. Moses was raised in the palace as Pharaoh's grandson. Little did they know, God had placed an assignment on Moses' life. What would rock both of their worlds? You never know what's coming down the line. In fact, it would be fitting to say that they were both Nicholas in each other's lives. One couldn't be rid of the other until God was finished with them both. Now that's talking about Moses, and it's also talking about Pharaoh. Their story begins in the book of Exodus, with Moses being placed in the water by his mother, and it ends with Pharaoh being placed in the water by God. Sounds intriguing? Yes, it is. We'll give a little background on them, but be encouraged to read about these guys for yourselves. As previously stated, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace as an Egyptian. However, he was born a Hebrew or an Israelite. They're both the same thing. He became a Nicholas in Pharaoh's life when he answered God's call for him to lead his people out of the bondage of Egypt. So Moses was born in Hebrew and Israelite, but the call on his life was him to lead his people out of Egypt. So he was kind of living, I would say, two lives. He was born Israelite and he was raised Egyptian, and it was going to do him well later in the years when he had to deal with Moses. God always knows what he's doing. So God empowered Moses to cause many plagues to come down on Pharaoh when he refused to give the Israelites their freedom. This person was once regarded fondly as a grandson of Pharaoh. Now it turns into a Nicholas of the worst kind. Nicholas has challenged the authority of the king. Each time Pharaoh vetoed the request for freedom, God allowed Nicholas to release another plague. This must have been maddening to the king. And how do we think poor Moses felt? To him, the king was Nicholas. Imagine his terror in having to deal with Pharaoh. Kings back then did not play. Moses was scared to death to face Pharaoh. About 40 years earlier, Moses had killed an Egyptian and had been literally hiding in the desert when God called him from the bush to lead his people. He thought he'd gotten away from Pharaoh, but look, here he is, arguing with God concerning his upcoming ordeal with Nicholas, who is still Pharaoh. The only thing that held him together was the fact that he feared God more than he feared Pharaoh, who was yet the Nicholas in his life. Why does God make him go back to Pharaoh? And why does God allow him to be Nicholas to a madman like Pharaoh? Let's try to answer this as we move on to our next king. As a matter of fact, we're dealing with two kings here. This was a father and a son. Their names are Nebuchadnezzar, and his son's name is Belteshazzar. Their Nicholas goes by the name of Daniel. Daniel rubs them both the wrong way. Daniel, like his predecessor Joseph, also has the gift of interpreting dreams. And also, like Joseph, his gifts land him in hot water on more than one occasion. Daniel's story can be found in the book of Daniel. Now, the reason Daniel was this pair's Nicholas was because he had the ominous job of telling them that they were doing wrong as it related to God. Now, no king wants to be told about his wrongdoing, and that wouldn't have helped Daniel at all. Okay? It wasn't, and isn't it same true today? We don't want anybody to rain on our parade. The president don't want to be told nothing. And being in a lot of cases, the president can be somebody that think he knows everything. So it would be a president for us, but a king to them. We don't want nobody telling us what to do when we get in a certain amount of power and prestige, because we think we know everything a lot of times. And that's simply not true. Nobody knows it all. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a lying thief who took credit for the beauty of Babylon, knowing full well that much of his success came from the gifts and talent of the Hebrews that he had captured and enslaved. His son Belshazzar, he was a party animal. He used the treasures that his father had stolen for the party. And that's just so disrespectful. He used the treasure from the temple of God to have all-night parties. That was Nicholas. That is to say, Daniel's dubious honor was to speak truth into the lives of both of these maniacs. He had to interpret information that didn't go over too well with the both of them. How about us? Do we have a Nicholas that points out our faults? And do we appreciate them? Probably not. Let's see what Saul, the first king of Israel, has to say about Nicholas. Saul's Nicholas is better known as David. Saul and David's story can be enjoyed in its entirety in the book of 1 Samuel. However, for this lesson, we'll point out the highlights of how David becomes Nicholas to Saul. In the beginning, David didn't start out rubbing Saul the wrong way. In fact, David was Saul's armor bearer. 1 Samuel 16:21 tells of Saul's great love for David. The trouble began when Saul disobeyed God and rejected by him, and subsequently God found favor with David. So, in other words, God lost favor with Saul, but found favor with David. They were two kings. David not yet king, but Saul was the king at the time. In fact, God sends his prophet Samuel to go anoint David as the king. Now, this was something Samuel did not want to do because Saul was still king at the time. So who in their right mind want to go anoint another king while you got one crazy king already sitting on the throne? So I can kind of see Samuel's hesitation. As the Lord starts to bless David as a mighty man of war, Saul begins to eye him with jealousy. No longer is David his favorite. He now becomes Nicholas to him. David, like many of his kind, don't even know that Saul's feelings has changed for him. As God blesses him, Saul's resentment grows. Now let's pause for a minute and apply this to our life. Pastors and deacons and church leaders have all had someone in their life who started out lower than them, and they admired their qualities, but then God starts to work with them and to promote them, and they start to teach at a higher level or preach at a higher level, and the people love them more than the pastor. Do you think some resentment is going to start to grow there? It usually does. They now becomes Nicholas instead of someone that they admired and loved as one of their own. You got to be awed by the gifts and blessings, but sometimes people with uncommon gifts set off insecurities in other people, causing them to become jealous and angry. What is generally unknown to the irritated one is that many times that Nicholas in their life has paid an awesome price to be where they are. No one was around when they were sitting alone with God on the backside of the desert, or on a lonely mountain tending sheep, or sitting in prison having done no wrong. The trials and suffering of heartache, broken relationships, misplaced dreams, dealing with all kinds of hardships and heartache, the rejection of being different. The Bible calls it peculiar, but we call it different. Long hours spent studying and preparing while others are asleep or gone their way. Yep, before we hate on Nicholas for being blessed, walk in Nicholas's shoes for a while. Or as Jesus would have said, drink from his cup. Because it's so easy to look at somebody's life and say, oh, they ain't doing nothing. But then when you try to do it, you realize not only do you not want to do it, it's extremely difficult. So we got to be careful how we talk about people, because you may just get a chance to walk in their shoes. And sometimes, if the truth be known, we can't even try the shoes on, let alone walk in them, because it's too much for us. We all are called to do something different. And if you're doing what you're not called to do, trust and believe it will become more and more difficult as time go on, because you can only be successful in the place God has put you. You cannot be a petunia in an onion patch and expect everything to go all right. You just got to do what you have been designed to do. Okay? Now, returning to our story. Saul finds himself hating David because God and the people loved him. David was truly Nicholas in his life. He couldn't go anywhere without hearing songs about David. Even his own son loved David, and that was a pickle in his pie. So this is the thing. His resentment grew to a hatred that lasted for a long, long time, probably the rest of his life. And this is somebody he started out loving, but because David became more loved and more esteemed than he, then Saul began to hate David more than anybody could ever imagine. Why didn't God just move David out of his life? Why was God taunting him with what he could be instead of just letting him go on about his business? Well, sometimes God tried to teach us something. God had given Saul a specific order, and instead of Saul doing what God had commanded him to do, he did half of it. And that's not what God wants. God wants you to fully obey. When he gives you an order to do, he wants you to fully obey it. He don't want you to use your mind half doing it. You know, that's what got Moses in trouble with God. God told him to speak to the rock so that water could come. And instead of speaking to the rock, he smacked the rock. And he got in trouble for it, because God requires that we be obedient to him. So whatever God has for us to do, it would be easier just to go ahead and do that instead of putting our own interpretation on it, and a lot of times messing it up. This is crazy. Now, at one point it seemed like David is the man. But bear in mind now, like we said before, everybody has somebody in their life that's a Nicholas. Somebody that rubs you wrong. Somebody that calls you out. Somebody that just simply gives you no peace. Now, who is David's Nicholas? Okay, let's see. While sitting in the neighborhood of Samuel, we will travel to Samuel's second book and set the scene. By now Saul is dead and David has become king. David used to be the golden boy and having whatever his heart desires. One day, David is home from war, and sitting on his roof, he spots a beautiful woman on her roof taking a bath. But the problem is, she has a husband. And on top of that, he is one of David's own soldiers and goes by the name of Uriah. But this does not deter David. He has her, impregnates her, and then has Uriah killed to cover his tracks. What about Nicholas? Where is he in David's life? Okay, in comes Nathan. Nathan is a prophet. Nathan is his Nicholas. Nathan spins a parable to David that appealed to the long-lost shepherd boy inside him, because David was once a shepherd as a child, and ultimately makes David face the truth of his treachery. What would have become of David if Nicholas had not come in by way of Haman? Haman, good thing that he did go in and talk to David, because David would have probably ended up being the biggest bully that ever lived and sat on the throne. I don't think David would have repented from what he did to Bathsheba and Uriah, because some people, the higher they go, the less they feel. So without Haman, that is David's Nicholas, we don't know if he ever would have turned from his wicked ways. Think about it as we head on to the book of Jonah and see who Nicholas was in his life. Turns out the whole city of Nineveh was his Nicholas. He did not want to be among these people. They were different from him, and he didn't want to be there. Now, are we like that? Black versus white, rich versus poor, city versus country. The Lord had commanded that he go preach to these people, and the Lord wouldn't let him get away from his Nicholas. God even prepared Jonah a special vessel to take him to his Nineveh in terms of a big old stinking fish. Now, we find Jonah getting to do what God had asked him to do, but it took a little doing. And read about Jonah in his book, and you'll find exactly what happened to him. Now, we spent a lot of time in the Old Testament. Let's take a few nicks from the New Testament before bringing this lesson to its conclusion. Consider these Nicholases. Mary was Martha's Nicholas. Read about her in the book of Luke, chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. How Mary got on Martha's last nerve concerning housekeeping. Okay? How about the constant irritation of the scribes and the Pharisees to Jesus? They had to be Nicholas to him. Always finger pointing, fault finding, and just messing with Jesus and his ministry. I wonder if Peter was a Nicholas to Jesus, and some of the disciples with his loud and outspoken opinions and his rash actions. There was something right there. Remember, he cut off the ear of an arresting officer. What about some of those sick people? When they make perfect Nicholases, always needing something special. Gotta be taken care of, taking so much time and attention, year after year after year, went into their welfare. Kind of like today. Many people deal with the sick Nicholas, and sometimes that Nicholas is mean as well as sick, and they seem to linger on and on. Why doesn't God call them home? Why are they here to vex our soul of their caretakers? Wouldn't it be easier and for all those concerned if the Nicholas just slipped away? But here's the rub. If we didn't have the Nicholas that we have in our life, we wouldn't be polished and smooth. That's what God allows Nicholas to do, is to smooth the rough edges out. Because if we never had troubles, we would never learn about faith and praying to God to deliver us. And then you come to learn that if God got you out of this, he'll get you out of that. If he pulled you through that back there, he'll bring us through this right here. And that's just the way life is. Remember, we always say, Life is a journey, and a journey can be a long time, and you learn so much on that journey, and you see so much out of the windows of your heart as you journey along this life. Now let's talk about Paul. Paul the apostle had his share of Nicholases. Many people of his day did not believe he was an apostle of Jesus. Given his track record, it's no wonder, because for much of his life, Paul had been a persecutor of the church. After his conversion, Paul then became a Nicholas to many people because they didn't believe that this was the same man who had persecuted the church. And Paul had a hard life. I don't know why he had struggled so much, but you know what? A lot of times the struggle is between the person and God. He knows exactly what it's going to take for your life to be able to do what it is he is calling you to do. I've always wondered about that, why people go through one thing or the other. And I do believe it's a special quilt, and you can't see it piece by piece. You can only see it when you put the whole quilt out, and then you see how the people and the patterns work together. I think that's so cool. And embroidery as well. On the back of embroidery, it just looks like a jumble of threads and bits and pieces. But on the front can be the most beautiful pictures that's ever been. And that's how our lives are. We can't see what God is doing all the time because it's not meant for us to see it all the time. We don't know our future. Only God knows that. And the plain truth of the matter is, He's teaching us. He's using these Nicholases in our life to teach us how to overcome hardships. And also to teach us that trouble will end. This too shall pass, no matter what it is, no matter where you are in life, any troubles you have, whether it be sickness, child raising, something on your job, something in your home, if you stick with God and do like David did in Psalm 51, you will see that this too shall pass. And let those Nicholases in your life use you to smooth you out and get you good and shiny for God's use. Well, that's all Nicholas is about. He waits. All we want to do, we want to wait on God, trust God, obey God, and do the things that God has asked us to do. And don't get in front of God. That's one thing that we tend to do as well. We can hear from God about something, but instead of us waiting for God to bring it to pass, we'll get all up in it and mess it all up. Look at Sarah and Hagar. Got up in it and messed it all up. And there's several characters in the Bible that thought that they would do what the prophecy was. Instead of just letting it flow, let God handle the prophecy. Because He don't need us to do anything. He got this. And that's what we need to realize. God got this. And He chooses the Nicholases in our life to help us to be stronger, to scrape off the confusion and the turmoil in our life. And we can only do that by going through something. And that's what Nicholas's job is. I know it was a funny title and it sounded ridiculous, but the thing is, the Nicholas in your life is the one that's going to cause you the most growth. And I just simply used that title because that was somebody that had vexed Ebony to the point that he got on her last nerve. What about Nicholas? I want to thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact the podcast. And we'll be back with more from Generational Ministries. Talk to you next time. God bless.